Hello, class. It's Dr. Maxfield DiCarlo. I wanted to post the lecture for this week. So I'm going to walk you through the slides. I'll also post these slides so that you can return to them and not have to listen to the whole lecture. This week we're talking about psychodynamic approaches, and I'm really excited about this because most of the time students come into having a discussion about Freud and psychoanalysis and psychodynamic approaches with a little bit of apprehension, a little bit of maybe some preconceived notions that they are not going to agree with this theory and that Freud was way off base. And so here's the thing. Freud presented a very thorough, comprehensive theory that not only is descriptive, it describes why people behave the way they do. It is also very prescriptive, which tells you like, hey, this is what you do about it if you want to change behavior. So it's very comprehensive in that way. That being said, he also presented us with some great sort of avenues for understanding what we shouldn't do in therapy, i.e., don't sleep with your clients, right? This is a huge ethical issue, and Freud had his own issues, and he had a history of sleeping with his clients, which is really not good. So don't do that. But let's also not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and let's just entertain the fact that there is some really good information. You don't have to agree with all of it, but it's a really good way of conceptualizing behavior and knowing how to intervene. So I'm going to walk you through this. I'm going to talk kind of fast because there's a lot of material here, and what I don't get to in this video, we will talk about during our question and answer session during the live class on Thursday evening. Okay, so let's just give you a little tiny bit of historical content. Many of our theorists, if you look at the theory they developed, sort of the basic concepts, you'll see that it kind of ties to their era and history, if you will. So, is it surprising to anyone that Freud, coming out of World War I, would be focused completely on what feels good, let's have a party, let's focus on our own sort of instinctual pleasure? Not really that surprising when you're coming out of World War I, right? So when we start thinking about this, we really should just keep in context that a lot of his focus that really is on instinctual drives and pleasure and what feels good could have had a lot to do with the historical content at the time. Just to give you kind of an overview so that it makes sense, sometimes we get confused in our terminology. Psychodynamic approaches is the big umbrella. Okay, psychodynamic approaches, big umbrella. Underneath of that umbrella, we have psychoanalysis, or what we would call id psychology. That's Freud's hallmark, right? We have ego psychology, which is Erikson's psychosocial stages. And this is probably something that you're really familiar with. I know that you've explored that more in the human development class. Also, object relations. This one's really interesting because most of the literature at this point, you look into the literature and you type in psychodynamic approaches, most of them are going to pop up with object relation stuff because that's sort of the way that this particular model is moving towards, very much this object relations. Self-psychology, or Jung, which we're going to touch base on just a tiny bit because really it's not evidence-based practice at this point. There is some stuff that might come up on your exam about that, so you need to have some just like basic information about that. But really in practice, not so much at this point. I'm sorry, self-psychology is Adlerian, right? And analytic psychology is Jung. Self-psychology is Adlerian, and that really looks a lot more of just not the intrapsychic processes that are going on, but also the social content as well. So again, all of these fall under this umbrella of psychodynamic approaches. And the interesting piece of this is that Freud sort of started all of this off. And when he did, he made these basic concepts that were then filtered through all of these approaches with some minor changes, some minor emphasis changes. So when we look at the basic concepts of what is important to know when we're looking at, we're going to start off talking about psychoanalytic, but across the board, all of these psychodynamic approaches really believe in this idea of deterministic and determinism. And what that means is that all behavior is meaningful and purposeful. We don't just sort of haphazardly behave a certain way or think a certain way or do a certain thing, is that there's an underlying motivation behind our behavior, and it's meaningful and purposeful. We are trying to survive, we're protecting ourselves, we are angry, or we're frustrated, or we're in love, or we're whatever it may be. There is a purpose and a meaning behind behavior. Behavior is determined primarily, again, this is probably a point of debate for many of us, but under this theoretical model, behavior is determined by unconscious drives, motivations, and instincts. Okay, so what does that mean? I'm going to show you a graphic in a few minutes, and it's going to show that 90% of our behavior and our motivations are based in the unconscious or subconscious, okay? So that's really important to keep in mind, is that our behavior is really determined by unconscious drives. If you will, think about it this way, is that our unconscious drives and our instincts are really like the puppet holder, the marionette, if you will, that we are behaving a certain way because, the strings are being pulled in a certain way. And that's really what Freud would have said, is that our behavior really comes from that. Okay, there are 5 major constructs. Okay. So I'm going to make another video later that tells you exactly how to do your weekly assignment, which you're going to be doing every week, the same thing with a different case study. But this is when we start talking about basic principles and the constructs, this is what I want you to walk me through when you're looking at the case. Where are you seeing these things play out? Because this is really how Freud conceptualized how behavior where it really comes from, the etiology, if you will, of behavior. So let's walk through these 5 constructs. The first one, here's that iceberg I was telling you about. That stuff, all the stuff that's under the water, that's the 90% of stuff that's not even in our consciousness. So in our consciousness is simply our thoughts and our perceptions. Right underneath of that is our memory and our stored knowledge. And then in our unconscious, we have all these very instinctual drives: fear, violent motivations, immoral urges, selfish needs, irrational wishes, shameful experiences, and unacceptable sexual desires. All of that stuff, that just represents some of the instinctual stuff that's going on with all of us. Now, is that stuff bad? No, that's not what Freud was saying at all. And I don't know that we want to go that far. What he was saying is that we have these drives that include all of this. All of us have impulses. All of us have sexual drives. All of us have urges and fears and irrational thoughts and irrational wishes. All of that is in our unconscious. And then how that plays out in our behavior is really the more functional piece that we need to look at. So we'll touch down here for a moment. Write this down. It's important. One of the major goals of psychoanalytic therapy is to bring the unconscious into the consciousness, right? Work it right up through to the unconsciousness, so that then instead of our behavior being based on impulses that we cannot control, we can bring it into the consciousness, and we can then control whether or not that impulse is going to dictate our behavior. Okay? So one of the goals of psychoanalytic therapy is to bring the unconscious into the consciousness so that then we can make decisions, conscious decisions about our behavior. Okay. The dynamic hypothesis is that the mind is really an energy system in which there's cause and effect. And this goes back to that determinism as our behavior is purposeful, right? There's a cause and effect. And we oftentimes in our behavior are creating these causes so that we can get the effect that we want, right? So the mind is an energy system. Along with understanding that the mind is an energy system, we have to understand that we're going to talk in a minute about how our personality and our mind is made up of 3 different parts. If there is tension that is created, and we'll talk about how that's created, if there's tension that's created as an energy system, that tension has to be then relieved in some way. So the dynamic hypothesis here really just speaks to the fact that it's an energy system where we give energy, we get energy, and when there's tension between the parts of our personality, we would then need to do something, behavioral response, to discharge that energy in some way. Don't worry. This is kind of sort of the abstract piece of this. It's going to make more sense in just a few moments. Economic hypothesis. This really isn't rocket science. Look at this for a second. There's a desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Wow. Anybody watching this video believe that that's not the case, right? We don't usually say, ooh, that's going to hurt. That's going to really leave a scar. I think I'll do that, right? No, we usually seek pleasure and avoid pain. Now, certainly, even as I say this, there are some pathologies that may incline us in different ways. But in general, human behavior is that we want to seek pleasure and avoid pain whenever possible. Okay, now comes the fun part, the structural hypothesis. Here's the most important piece. You've probably read about this in your undergrad. You probably have thought about this before, read about it, and maybe even said, okay, I understand this on some level, but how does that really play out in counseling? Like, I just don't get it. So I'm hoping that this will be helpful. Okay, so when we think about your mind, your personality, it is based on 3 different elements. And what I want you to imagine is a seesaw, right? And on one extreme, you have your id. And your id is like all of your instincts, right? It is all of your survival instincts, your wanting pleasure, avoiding pain, everything that you would need for survival, right? God created us with basic needs. And then your id is all about getting those basic needs met. However, you can, right? So it's instinctual, okay? On the far extreme of that, you have your super ego. And your super ego is something that is developed over time. Your id, we're born with our id. It's instinctual, it's impulsive, right? We're born with that. Your super ego is something that is developed over time, and it really focuses in on your morals, your values. It's basically ends up being sort of like your moral compass. Your ability to decide what is right and wrong based on a set of value systems. So it's very culturally driven how we develop this, but it's sort of your moral compass, if you will. Okay, so you have on one side your instincts. Hey, that feels good. I want to have that. If that's mine, I'm going to take it, even if it's not mine. Right? Think about a toddler. Right? What do? Everything's impulsive. Everything is very instinctual. Like they do things because they want to, and they don't really have any sense of the people around them. And if that is breaking a social norm in some way, they're just like, I want it, so give it to me, right? So that's your id. On that far other side, you have your super ego who says, I don't know if that's a good idea. No, you can't just take something from someone and steal it. That's not a good idea. Okay. So one example I like to give is like, sure, I would love to be a millionaire. That sounds like a great idea. So I'd love to be a millionaire. My id would say, hey, you should be a millionaire. You should go rob a bank, right? You could have instant gratification. You could have what you want. You could have the money that you want. Okay, so my id thinks that. Nothing wrong with that. What comes wrong with that is that if I actually played out that behavior. But the id says, this is what I want and I want it now. You should rob a bank. And my super ego on the far other side says, you know what, Jen? I don't really think that you want to go to jail. That's probably not a good idea. And, you would appreciate your money more if you earned it. You can't just steal it. It's not right. Right? And so my moral compass says, I don't think that's a really good idea. Okay. And then what you have in the middle, thinking of a seesaw, right? It's the fulcrum in the middle that teeters back and forth, is your ego. That's the one that mediates between your id and your super ego. And it says, in this situation, which way should I go? Should I rob a bank? Or should I go with my super ego and say, nah, that's not a good idea, don't do it, right? And thankfully, my ego is strong enough to know which way to go, and so I don't rob a bank, okay? And I work for MacU, right? See, there you go. All right, so this is what is happening in every situation, right? Is that we have instincts on one side, we have our morals on the other side, and our id is in the middle, mediating between each one. Now, one might think, oh, well, the superego is good then, and the id is bad. Not true at all, because there are situations in our experience, in our environment, in our lives that require survival. Okay? How about this? When you start thinking about impulses, right? Very, very basic level, sexual impulses, right? There are times when that's appropriate. Your superego might help you understand when those are appropriate based on your value system, but at times your ego is going to allow your id to be the one that's dominant because it's appropriate. In survival situations, this is really important. This is what's going to urge you to say, hey, I'm hungry. We better eat. I'm thirsty. I'm dehydrated. I need to give in to that right now. Okay? So there's really no need to be like, oh, well, id, instinct, impulse, that's bad. No, it's survival. And then it's mediated, if you will, by your ego that helps decide in which situations we should let either the id or the superego be dominant. I like to think of this example is that not that long ago, we went to the beach and we were sitting on the beach, and my youngest daughter, we said, hey, listen, you can't go in the water, but you can walk down to the water. Just don't go in the water without one of us parents, right? So then my husband and I proceed to sit down in the sand, and we're just sitting there talking, and all of a sudden we look up, and my daughter, who is quite literal, is walking on a pier that has like fallen apart, and she's hopping from post to post. Now, she is far out into the water, but she's not actually in the water because she's standing on the posts. Yes? Okay, this is good child thinking, childlike thinking, very concrete. I'm not in the water. Of course, if a wave came, a big wave, she probably would have been knocked off the post, okay? In that moment, my husband's behavior, right? He didn't think about what to do. It wasn't even in his consciousness. It was an instinctual drive. He jumps up, and I'm telling you, I've never seen this man run so fast in his life, okay? It was instinctual survival. My child is in harm's way, and he ran so fast and got her off of the pier, okay? So that was, in that situation, his ego said, ooh, you know what? Survival, yes, id, go for it. And let the id be in control, okay? On the other hand, I, in my nurturing self, was sitting on the beach waiting for this child to return because I personally was going to help develop her super ego so that she will never be in this situation again where she questioned what was right or wrong. And when she returned, I instilled in her the fear of God, that she would never do that again. So my super ego took over to instill these moral values of listening to what I was saying and never being in that situation again. Okay. I hope that makes sense and is an example that makes sense for you. This is really important when we start conceptualizing and thinking about our clients. So when we're thinking about clients and situations, we should be asking ourselves, where is this behavior coming from? Is it really impulsive? I mean, we all know people who are very impulsive, right? They can't control maybe their aggression and their anger and their frustration. Or they it's all about pleasure. It's all about whatever it is that they want to do. And they at times aren't paying attention to how that might impact other people. They're really functioning more in their id. And then on the other hand, we know of people who really have, I like to say, an overactive, overdeveloped superego, right? These are the folks that are so bound by rules and regulations that they can't ever step out of that. They appear to not be able to have any fun or experience pleasure because they're so concerned about rules, regulations, the way it has to be done, what's right and wrong, that they can never, if you will, just let their hair down and just have a good time. And so what happens in these situations is that it's not really an issue that one is more dominant than the other, the id or the superego. It's actually an issue of the ego not being able to, is not strong enough to mediate between the two. So our focus is never to, squelch the id or boost up the superego or squelch the superego. Our focus in therapy is always to strengthen the ego so that the ego can mediate between the two extremes in a better way and function better. So again, the goal of therapy, right? Remember that hypothesis that we were talking about before with the iceberg, is to bring the unconscious into the consciousness so that we can make conscious choices about our behavior. And that's done through providing insight. And we'll talk about those ego sustaining techniques, that kind of thing in a few moments. But our second goal is always to strengthen the ego so that the ego can mediate between the id and the superego. Okay? I'm hoping that makes sense, is that that's always our goal, is to make the ego be able to be strong enough to, in any given situation, say, you know what, in this situation, yes, we need survival, we need pleasure, we need instinct, we're going to go with that. Ooh, wait, hold up, in this situation, we're going to go with the superego, and we're going to go with those value system and be able to fluidly mediate between the two of those. Our ego is made up of our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Oftentimes, what we interpret as our self-identity and our sense of identity is based on how well the ego is able to mediate between the id and superego. So what that means is that, have you ever met somebody and you're like, oh, wow, that person's so impulsive, right? So that's really because, again, the ego is not strong enough to balance the id and superego, and so you tend to be on the side of the id. The id really functions to assess what the external world is demanding and requiring in any given situation, and then try to regulate how we respond, our internal world's reaction to the outside world. And so the ego is in charge of mediating that and assessing what the demands of the external world are, so that then we internally can respond appropriately. Sometimes the external demands, I would dare to say often, the external demands of our situation are too high for our ego, because our ego is weak. And so what happens is that instead of responding in a functional way, in a healthy way, we end up using defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms, they're would be conceptualized as something that the ego uses, right? A strategy that the ego uses to diffuse the energy, the tension between the id and the superego and the external world. And it uses defense mechanisms to relieve that tension. So we're going to talk about defense mechanisms in a moment and what those really look like. But again, a defense mechanism is used by the ego when the ego just can't manage the situation. I like to think of it as this way, is when the ego is back to the wall and it's like, I don't know what to do. Should I let the id be in charge or the superego be in charge? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And then it just kind of shuts down, becomes paralyzed, right? Because it's not strong enough to respond, and uses a defense mechanism to release that tension. Okay. The adaptive hypothesis is just exactly that. Individuals attempt to cope with societal demands by using defense mechanisms when the ego is not strong enough to manage the demands of that situation. I'm going to skip over the psychosexual stages for just a moment and come back to it. Defense mechanisms then are defined as an intrapsychic process that operates unconsciously. We don't realize we're doing it, to protect the person from a threatening, anxiety-producing thoughts, feelings, or impulses. So the important element here is that defense mechanisms are never consciously chosen to use, right? They are unconscious, which stands to reason. If one of the goals of psychotherapy and psychoanalytic therapy is to bring the unconscious into consciousness, we want to bring the defense mechanisms, bring insight into what defense mechanisms we're using, so that then we can choose whether or not we're going to use them, as opposed to just our behavior being dictated by these defense mechanisms that we're not even consciously aware that we're doing. This is why Freud believed that people can't change their behavior and their personality structure or anything like that unless they were working with a psychoanalyst, because you don't know, and you need someone to interpret and bring insight into your behavior, because it's in an unconscious level. Okay, this is one of my very, very favorite things to talk about when we are talking about psychoanalytic theory. And this actually goes across the board in all psychodynamic approaches. Defense mechanisms. I love this little chart. And if you look up, you were to do a Google search on defense mechanisms, you'll see different names for the same thing: displacement and projection, and rationalization and intellectualization. They're very different terms, exactly the same definition. So here are sort of the basics that I want to run through. And this is what I want you guys to remember, is that we all use all of these at certain times in our life, okay? So as I'm reading through these and giving examples, I hope that you will realize that using these, maybe it brings insight into some of your own behavior or the behavior of people around you, and hopefully clients as well. So let's walk through this quickly. Displacement. Okay, so this is where we are discharging pent-up feelings, usually of hostility or anger, frustration, on an object that is less dangerous than the original object that invoked that emotion, okay? So what that means is, let's say that I've had a really long day at the office and I am so frustrated with my boss because they didn't do what I wanted, and I'm frustrated and angry. But here's the thing, natural consequences would say that it's probably not a good idea for me to yell at my boss if I want to continue to work, right? So I know that there's a consequence there. So I'm going to avoiding pain, right? So I'm going to avoid that pain. I'm not going to yell at my boss. Instead, I get home and I sit down and my husband walks through the door. Now, all he does is walk through the door and breathe in my presence, and I just go off on him, right? And I'm like, you're so frustrating. I can't believe that. He hasn't done anything. He simply was trying to breathe. I know none of you have ever done anything like this, right? Maybe it's not your husband or your partner. Maybe it is your child comes in. And the next thing you know, because hopefully this person in your life is a little bit more understanding and there won't be an immediate consequence of your behavior. They are less dangerous. Maybe there's less consequences if you actually behave this way, right? So you're taking something that or another person or another situation and you are displacing all of your frustration about something completely different onto this less threatening person or situation. Okay, so an example here. After her new baby brother came home from the hospital, the parents discovered that Cheryl had dismembered her favorite doll, right? So clearly, hopefully, Cheryl's not going to dismember her baby brother, okay, because she in big trouble for that. But as a displacement object, she used her doll to express her frustration. Here's another one. Mark slams the door to the classroom after failing the exam. Like, that door has been so wrong to me, and discharges the tension and the frustration by directing it at an inanimate object, even though he's frustrated with the exam and failing the exam. Usually in class we talk more about these, like if anybody else has examples. So come prepared in class if you have any examples of these that you've used. Rationalization, I love this one. Why? Because we do it all the time. I mean, we do this all the time and oftentimes aren't even aware that we're doing it. This is where we justify our failure with a more socially acceptable reason instead of the real reason. Why? Again, to avoid the pain of maybe being rejected or having to admit that we did something wrong or that we weren't good enough or didn't meet the mark. We justify it in our mind. So I actually really like this example. After Carla rejected him, Phil told her friends he didn't think she was all that attractive anyway. And he wasn't really crazy about her, right? Instead of, oh my goodness, this person doesn't like me, we say, oh, they weren't that attractive. I don't really like it anyway. I wouldn't have wanted to date that person. Right? So we rationalize. The one I like to always say is like when you go for a job interview, maybe you don't get the job, and then the rationalization is, well, I wouldn't have wanted to drive that far. It was so far away. I wouldn't want to have to make that commute, right? So we rationalize something as the reason in order to avoid the pain of feeling rejected or that we weren't good enough. The other example here, Jack told his parents he got a C in psychology because all the A's and B's went to the students that cheated on the test, right? We rationalize like, oh, well, if I had cheated, I could have gotten an A, but I chose not to cheat. We rationalize. This next one is by far my favorite defense mechanism, reaction formation. This is where we transform an anxiety-producing thought into something that is the exact opposite in our consciousness. So we're, in this sense, we are aware in our consciousness of our behavior, but it's the exact opposite of how we unconsciously are feeling. My thought about this one is sometimes when my husband might have frustrated me and I really want to talk to him about, how I'm feeling, about how he did something wrong or didn't live up to my expectation, what do? I make dinner. Make him his favorite meal. And I sit down to dinner, have a glass of wine with our dinner, and I'll make sure everything's just the way he wants, right? Because inside, I'm really frustrated with him. So we do the exact opposite. Again, I know no one here ever does that, or maybe some of you are like getting slapped across the face. Yes, I do that. Oh my goodness, I do that one. The example here, John has unconscious hostility towards his father, but he acts very affectionate towards him. I see this one all the time when I see kids that come in and we do family therapy after a divorce, and the kid will come in and we're doing some individual stuff and she's so angry at dad for the situation, for things not working out, for whatever reason, so angry. And then they come in for family therapy and this kid is like sitting on dad's lap, hugging all up on him, acting the exact opposite of all of the emotional reactions that they're really having, because those ones are more socially acceptable. Here's my good example of this. A few years back, we were driving home from Myrtle Beach and we pulled over to this gas station and jump out of the car, start pumping gas, and this man comes running up to us and hands me a DVD and says, I promised God I would give the next family that I saw this DVD, and runs away. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what's going on? I look at this DVD and it's a pirated copy of the Smurfs. So this gentleman had gone to a theater and videotaped the entire movie, pirated the movie, felt so guilty about his stealing. He stole the movie, felt so guilty about that, but then his opposite reaction was, I'm going to give something away. I'm going to be benevolent and give something away and do the exact opposite of what he just did to neutralize with the action that unconsciously he was feeling guilty over. Okay, regression. Regression is when we return to a more primitive level of behavior. So, from human development that certain behaviors, given cognitive development and behavioral development, would fall within the realm of normalcy. But then as we grow up, that certain behaviors should stop or be eliminated. So this is where we see someone who has moved past a certain behavioral or a certain behavior and regress back to a previous behavior as a way of a defense and to neutralize this demand on the ego. So an example of this is after Sue Ann's brother was born, she began to suck her thumb again. Sometimes you see this with bedwetting when something stressful has happened and the child can't sort of negotiate that. The ego's not strong enough, then we'll see regressive behaviors back to like bedwetting, that kind of thing. Here's my example of this. A couple years ago, we went to New York we usually go to New York for Christmas. I'm on the East Coast, right? So we go to New York for Christmas, and we see the Christmas trees, and we go see the Radio City Music Hall Christmas Spectacular, and we go to Macy's and see Santa, and we do this whole trip. It's like 24 hours, crazy in New York City, and then we take the train home. This was when my youngest, the twins, were in preschool, and one of my daughter's friends, who was in preschool, they had a play date, and I was talking to this mom about our trip, and she said, "Oh, well, we want to go." Okay. And so she sort of invited herself on this New York trip with us, which was strange and awkward. So here we are, and we decided that in order to sort of manage that situation, because we didn't really want to invite anybody on the trip, that we would meet them while we were in New York and go to the American Girl store. So I don't know if any of you have ever had the pleasure of going to the American Girl store, but it's like an entire city of dolls. And on the top level, they have a restaurant where they like serve your doll food, and your doll sits with you while you have lunch or dinner or tea. And the waiters and waitresses all wear tuxedos, and it is a big hoopla. Okay. So we get to New York, and we're at the hotel, and we meet these folks who are impeding on our trip, and say, okay, well, we're going to go to the American Girl place. We made these reservations, and we decide to take the subway to the restaurant. So we start off, and if any of you've been in the New York subway, you know that sometimes getting through the turnstiles with your little ticket is a challenge. You put it in, and then hopefully the gate opens up, and then you get to walk through the turnstile and then get on your train. So the parents and the kid, though the kids made it through the turnstile, the mom made it through, and the husband is having trouble getting through the turnstile. And so he's getting kind of frustrated and agitated. No one's really paying attention because we're so busy with our 5 kids trying to get them ready to go through the turnstile. So finally, he gets through. We start going through the turnstile. We get to the other side, and by the time we get to the other side of this turnstile, this 50-year-old man is on the floor, rolling on the floor in the New York subway, having a full-on temper tantrum. He's like wailing and, kicking and screaming and rolling on the floor in the subway. Okay? This is a really extreme example of regression, right? Is that this 50-year-old man, this is not normative behavior for an adult, is rolling. I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is the New York subway. Do you know what you're rolling in? But whatever. So he regresses to an earlier behavior that would have been appropriate if you were 2, maybe even 3. But then much beyond that, maybe not so much so. So regression of behavior. Now, it's not always this dramatic. Sometimes I see folks in therapy who come in and, their thinking process just reverts to a very primitive, like, well, he hurt me, so I'm going to hurt him type behavior, right? Which again is would be considered really a regression in their cognitive function of understanding interpersonal relationships. So, okay. Enough said about that one. Repression. This is where we repress memories and into the unconscious, and we don't we sort of block any threatening memories from coming into our consciousness. So think about a time that maybe you've experienced either a trauma or a very highly stressful situation, and just kind of think about that, and then think about maybe right after it happened, you didn't have access to all of those memories. You couldn't really put all the pieces together about what happened. And that's because our brain shuts down. It just says, "Ooh, I'm on overload. No, I can't take it all in." The interesting piece is that you are actually taking it all in, because you oftentimes can pull up and access that memory later on once things calm down a bit, right? This is what we're really doing a lot of times in trauma narratives, is helping people walk through the trauma, understand different elements of the trauma. And oftentimes as we do that, they will remember, "Ooh, wait, I forgot that this happened. And oh, that happened before this happened." And they'll start getting more and more details about the actual trauma. So the example here, people held in a concentration camp may not be able to remember what happened while they were there. Those memories might be blocked. Abuse victims sometimes don't recall events from their childhood. So again, sort of the brain protects itself by blocking out those memories. Really interesting, some of the newer research though that shows that memories are not firm, factual sort of files in our brain, that every time we bring up a memory, we are solidifying a path, and that path might change to the memory. So that's a conversation for another day, but just to suffice to say that repression is when we can't really pull up those memories. And then the last one, denial. So this is sort of like an argument when we start talking about denial. Is this functional sometimes? Sure. Again, the reason that the ego uses these is because there's tension that needs to be released. So in some ways they're very functional, albeit not healthy, but functional, to release that tension. So denial is when we refuse to admit that something unpleasant is happening, or we're having a taboo emotion that we don't want to admit that we're experiencing. So example of this, 16-year-old Tom was using drugs, but his parents didn't believe it when the principal told them about the problem. Or this one I like too is a kind of, we have this sort of cliche, the midlife crisis, but can fit right into this sort of denial of getting older. 50-year-old Bob, he wears clothes that a teenager would wear, and he drives a sports car. Right? So again, denial might be very functional, but maybe not healthy for us. Okay, so all of these defense mechanisms, I really want you to be thinking about, are my clients using these? Am I seeing this in my own life? Do I have a tendency towards using this? Because in therapy, as we are doing ego modification techniques, is what we would be doing is bringing insight into when a client might be using these. And by bringing insight into it, then it's bringing it out of the unconscious into the consciousness, so that then we would be able to decide whether or not, yeah, you know what, I am displacing my emotions. Okay, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm not going to, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to not use rationalization. Like I need to address the fact that I'm feeling rejected or hurt in this situation. So that's what we would really want to do. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the stages, psychosexual stages. At this point in time, I want to just make sure that everybody is super clear here. It's important for you to know these. It could possibly be on your licensing exam, so it's really important that you know this stuff. Now, is this, in this day and age, would we consider this to be sort of like evidence-based, this piece of this? Probably not. It's important for you to know though. So when we're talking about these psychosexual stages, just know that whenever we are asking or we are looking at symptoms in the present, and then going back to try to trace back what might have happened historically that caused those symptoms, okay? That's really useful. That's useful in us to understand the etiology, where the root of the behavior is. If you're of the persuasion in therapy that we need to know the root of the problem in order to change the outcome, then this is really important. Not all therapies really align themselves. Solution focused, for example, doesn't really care where the problem came from, just wants to look at solutions. So there's just some fault that is inherent in when we are asking clients, so what do you think happened between birth to 18 months? First off, we know that people can't remember, right? We don't have the ability to have conscious memory this young. So we can hypothesize that there was some kind of fixation based on the symptoms that the client is coming in with right now. But we might not know. We might not know. So this isn't foolproof. But for what it's worth, let's look at these. Oral is birth to 18 months. The anal stage is 18 months to 3 years. Phallic stage is 3 years to 6 years. And then Freud also suggested that after 6 years, there's a latency phase where there wasn't really any big task going on. And then we return to the genital phase. And we stayed in that phase throughout adulthood. So this was the workings and the beginnings of what Erikson looked at as well. I'm going to show you a chart comparing Erikson and Freud and their stages of development. But this is sort of the foundation. So let's look at this a little bit. The oral stage, it kind of makes sense. From birth to 18 months, what are you doing? You are surviving by being fed. Yeah, right? This makes sense. So all of the pleasure and relief of tension is related to feeding and the organs associated with your mouth, okay? In this stage, it is very important for building trust that we are responded to, right? Think about a baby. A baby screams, and what does the parent do? Hopefully responds and tries to like figure out what's going on. You need to be fed. You need your diaper changed. You need sleep. You need to just be coddled and held. And so through this sort of interplay of stimuli response, we learn as an infant, our brain, if you will, is hardwired with, here's the stimuli response, and someone will respond, and I can trust that my attachment is going to respond to my needs. And so trust is really what is established in 0 to 18 months, all related to this like survival of eating and sucking, okay? So here's an interesting thing. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Boss Baby, right? You know how they if you haven't, you should watch it. It's funny. But the pacifiers, how they go between worlds, right? And that sucking, because that's what babies do. They calm themselves through that sucking action, because that's like that is the calming trust that I'm taking care of thing, okay? So this is why we have pacifiers, yeah? Okay, all right. So what we see when children, I'm going to turn the light on here, when there's a fixation, and by fixation we mean that there was some kind of hiccup, something happened that they didn't quite move through this stage and develop in a healthy way. So what that looks like in adults and well, Freud would say that all of this happens before 6 years old. So what we would see if this did not develop appropriately would be someone who really has difficulty trusting other people. And because of that, they may be very pessimistic. They might think of the world, right, as no one's ever going to meet my needs. Nobody cares about my needs, all of that, okay? So that is really what you would see in someone who did not make it through this stage without having some kind of fixation. Likewise, you might see that the person is very dependent, has very dependent traits, right? And that really is an outpouring of, if people are going to meet my needs, then I'm going to over the top latch myself to them to see if I can control them meeting my needs. I need someone to love me. I need constant nurturing. I need affirmation because I didn't get that. And so now I need to have this. I want you to think about these stages as really our brain's hardwiring. They're hardwiring into a pathway of behavior and thinking. No infant from 0 to 18 months is thinking, you know, my mom didn't give me a bottle when I wanted it, and so now I can't trust the world, right? No one's thinking that. But the constant routine of behavior, if they were continuously not having their needs met, there was some kind of trauma or neglect that happened, then what you see here is that then there's this hardwiring in the brain that you cannot get your needs met, and that things never work out the way you anticipate they will. Can it be corrected? Yeah, here's the great thing. With all of the new research on neuroplasticity, we know even at a biological level, we can develop new pathways in our brain. And again, the goal of therapy then, in this psychoanalytic perspective, is to really have a corrective emotional experience where you can delve back into those past attachments and correct that sort of hardwiring. Okay? All right, the anal stage. Let's talk a little bit about that. Individuals learn to assign autonomy and manage anger and also oftentimes hostility during this stage. Okay? Now, what's going on in a child's life from 18 months to 3 years old? Potty training, right? And quite literally, I know this will get a giggle, but quite literally, at this stage in the game, children are learning when to hold on and when to let go. They're learning the ability to hold on to, if they have to go to the bathroom, they hold on to it till they get to the toilet, and then when it's okay to release that. It's flexibility is what we're really talking about. And it's not just a physiological process, but it's also an emotional process that goes along with that. So from 18 months to 3 years old, the task is flexibility, learning to hold on and to let go. So folks who have had some sort of fixation and not made it through this stage without having some kind of hiccup tend to be very rigid. They tend to not be able to cope when things change, and they would have to employ some flexibility. And they tend to have more characteristics of a lot of structure. Things have to be a certain way, right? So I would say that I wouldn't want to say that they are, there's no always in any of this, but they may tend towards more OCD, more very structured. Things have to be this certain way. If they're not, then they're just riddled with anxiety because they haven't learned that ability to sort of adjust and adapt and be flexible. Okay, so if some of you are now going, oh no, I think I might have had some sort of fixation in an anal stage. It's okay. It's okay. It's something that we can work on. But it's important to just kind of realize that when we're seeing clients that are coming in that are very rigid, have a hard time seeing other perspectives, maybe have some self-worth issues, have a hard time being autonomous, this might be what's going on. All right, and then the final stage that we're going to talk about is the phallic stage. This is where pleasure is really associated with the genitalia. So again, this is where kids from 3 to 6 are starting to be more aware of their body. They're starting to become aware of the differences between genders. And so this is where the whole idea of the Oedipal complex comes in, where males will, or children will be attracted to their opposite sexed parent, right? This makes sense. Part of this is kind of, the behavioralist would say this is social learning, but that we start to see gender roles. And so my example of this is that when my twin son, he was maybe 5 years old, he would go pick dandelions for me. Like, and nobody taught him this, right? He would pick dandelions and he would bring them in the house and say, Mom, see, I get you flowers every day. You should love me more than Daddy. Right? Because he was learning the role of what the male in a relationship would look like. And so he wanted to trump Daddy and have all of my affection. So this also, in reverse with females, this also happens where they're, daddy's little girl, or and they also start to realize that there are differences between males and females. Like, their body is different, their role according to culture in gender roles are different as well. If there is some sort of fixation in this area, this is what happens. It's kind of like the DSM, where it's either the person has really low self-esteem, like, I don't know where I fit in the world, I never could kind of find my place, and I'm really low self-esteem. Or it could be the exact polar opposite, and it could be that they have really high self-esteem. Maybe they're really vain, maybe they're really ambitious, maybe with that high self-esteem, it's that, like, they felt like they couldn't find what their role was, so they are going to make their role, and they're going to be the best at everything, and they're all as sort of a way of addressing this, like, not feeling like they understand where they fit in. So it can be either extreme. So we'll see that when someone hasn't negotiated the phallic stage. Interestingly enough, if you get fixated in one stage, all subsequent stages usually are impacted. So if you make it through trust and the oral stage just fine, but then have some kind of fixation in the anal stage, then you're probably also going to have some issues in the phallic stage. So it usually is. So if you're looking at a case and you're thinking, wow, this is like all the stages, well, it might be, because if there's an oral problem in the oral stage, it will impact the development in all subsequent stages. All right. So hopefully you're still following along with me, but here's the last piece I'm going to talk about as far as concepts, basic concepts for psychoanalytic, is this idea of anxiety. Freud talked a lot about 3 types of anxiety. And again, these anxieties really come out of the id, ego, and superego not being able, or the ego not being able to manage the demands of the outside world, and so anxiety is produced. So again, in your templates, when you're talking about in your case analysis, you're talking about how behavior is developed and anxiety is developed. It's really based on this push-pull between the demands of the environment and our inner psychic process between the id, ego, and superego. Neurotic anxiety is anxiety that's based in unconscious worry about us possibly losing control over our id urges, right? Our impulsivity, like we're not going to be able to control our impulses. And then there might be some punishment or inappropriate for inappropriate behavior. So neurotic anxiety is very much about managing id urges. I like to think about this as my example of this is right after I had my twins, okay? I used to lay in bed at night and think, which completely irrational, completely neurotic anxiety, but I would think about survival, right? Id, survival. I would think about what would I do if there was a fire in my house? How many sheets would I have to tear apart in order to tie together, to put the twins together in like a little satchel, to hoist them outside my bedroom window, to get them safely out of the house? And so I would play over in my mind Like, could I put them in a pillowcase? Would they both fit in a pillowcase? Would it be bad for them to be in a pillowcase for a certain amount of time? Or would I just have to tie them together? And how many sheets would it take? Would that be a queen sheet, or could I use a king size sheet? Or how long would it take me to cut these sheets and tie them together if I was in my house and it was burning down? So clearly, right, this is all very based in neurotic anxiety. It's survival, it's impulsive, not really based on much reality. But I would think about this, okay? Reality anxiety is a fear that's a real world based. It's usually caused by some easily identified experience or event that's happened in someone's life, or they've seen happen to someone else, so that it's based in a reality of their own experience. Example here is that a person might fear a dog bite when they're near a dog that looks like it might be mean. And so oftentimes you see avoidant behavior for these reality anxiety type fears. And the last one is moral anxiety. This involves a fear of violating our own moral principles, that we might not live up to our expectation, our standard. And I see lots of folks in therapy who come in because they are fearful that they're not living up to their standard. They're afraid that they're not being, I have a Christian private practice, that they're not living up to Christian principles and standards, or that they're very anxious because they, are in a very abusive relationship, but their value system is such that they don't believe that they can, despite physical and emotional abuse, leave that relationship because it would violate their moral value system of the sanctity of marriage. So those are kind of the moral anxieties that can come up. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about the interventions that we usually use in psychoanalytic, and this will cross over into other psychodynamic approaches that we'll talk about as well. The first one here is a blank slate. We maintain our anonymity in our therapeutic relationships. So we are not trying to be very personable. We are not trying to, self-disclose very, very, very minimally in this approach. That's not true in all approaches, particularly when it's person-centered. Self-disclosure is okay. But in this approach, we do not want to use self-disclosure because we want us as a therapist to basically be a blank slate for which the client is going to project onto us issues that might have come up with their early attachments. So if we were to be very personable and have the client get to know us really well, they wouldn't be able to project onto us their early attachments. And so we would basically, the whole framework for this therapy would fall apart. We want to foster a transference relationship. We want the client to be projecting onto us these early attachments and their emotions and feelings that are maybe unconscious, and we want to bring that in. Then we can analyze that. We'll analyze the transference to be able to bring that into the consciousness. So an example of this is a gentleman that comes into therapy. He's come in every week. He just talks about work. Oh, this is what happened at work this week. Oh, this happened at work this week. And then all of a sudden he comes into therapy, and one week he's like, I feel like you as a therapist, you're so critical. Wait a minute, we've never even talked about, I never provided any, wait, you're so critical. I don't feel like you like me. I feel like you always have something bad to say. And all of a sudden he's projecting onto the therapist all of these things that then we can tie back to his mom was very critical. He could never live up to her expectation. So he's projecting onto the therapist what he experienced in his early attachments. And then once that's brought into the consciousness, then he can deal with that and have a corrective emotional experience with the therapist of being nurtured and being like, it's okay sometimes you don't live up to the expectation, or what should the expectation be? And you can start adjusting that. Okay. Touching down here for just a moment on countertransference. Countertransference is something that we cannot always avoid, but we need to be self-aware about. Transference is when the client transfers onto us their feelings about early attachments. Countertransference is when we as the therapist are triggered by something in our client, and then we end up reacting to the client because of our own stuff. So our own personal experiences and attachments are getting in the way of our ability to be therapeutic. So although we can't totally avoid countertransference, we do want to try to minimize it as much as possible in therapy. Oops, hang on one second here. Okay, so my example here, let me get the PowerPoint back up, sorry. Oops, gotta share my screen again. Share. Sorry. Hang on a second. Okay, so my example of countertransference. I had a teenager who came in, young adult that I was seeing for, this is some years back, was seeing for a while, and she would come in every week and completely unmotivated to do anything. And she had resources, she had experienced a significant loss in her life, but she just didn't want to do anything. She was, I think, on the cusp of graduating high school into like her first year of college, really just not motivated. And she would come in every week and clearly was getting something out of therapy. But she was one of those that every time she came in, I would think, oh, it's gonna be a really long hour, right? And I really wasn't in tune with my own countertransference at that point. I just knew that I was frustrated every time she came, and I was like, oh, it's gonna be a long hour. And that'll happen in therapy. But one day she shows up and she brings with her to therapy her puppy. So now here's my office, and I've got carpeting and a nice leather couch, and she brings this little puppy with her to therapy. And honestly, I have no idea what she said. The entire time she was talking, I had no idea what she was saying, because I literally was just thinking, dear Lord, please make that puppy pee on her so she has to leave. And so the whole time she was talking, I had no idea what she was saying. Just, dear Lord, please make that puppy pee on her. Then they'll both have to leave. So it was at that point in time that I realized that there was something going on. It took that puppy, because this was a long while ago, so it took that long for me to kind of be self-aware that I had some countertransference stuff going on. So after she left, I started beating myself up and thinking, I'm the world's worst counselor. I can't believe that I was so obsessed with this puppy, and I don't remember what she said. And so I sought supervision and also sought peer supervision with some therapists that I really highly esteem, and said, listen, this is what was going on with me. The whole time I just wanted her puppy to pee on her. And so we had some conversation about that, and I was able to sort of identify what was going on with me, that there was something in her and her lack of motivation that was really triggering a response in me. So ignore the noise in the background, sorry. That she was that was really very triggering for me. And so once I realized that, then I was able to sort of work through my own issues, deal with that countertransference. And then I was able to work with her, and I worked with her for a good long time, and she made some remarkable progress. So all that to say that we need to be very self-aware and understand what the red flags are for us that are start going up. When we start feeling a certain way about a client, we need to sort of look at that and say, hey, what's going on for me? What's being triggered in me by this client? Not that that's not going to happen, but the more aware we are of that, the more we can ensure that we then stop, get supervision, maybe get therapy if we need to do that, so that it doesn't impede our ability to work with a client. Okay, another piece is free association. During our question and answer session, we're going to watch a video of Dr. Corey working with Stan, the case of Stan, and you're going to see that he does some free association. So that's something to keep in mind, is where you're really just looking for themes. So I give you a word, anything that comes to mind, just the themes that come to mind to help sort of draw out the unconscious connections that are being made. Interpretation is really where we work on what we call ego modification, is when we allow the client to talk about past situations, and then we interpret what's going on in the present related to the past to bring it into the consciousness, and that interpretation then can strengthen the ego and help the ego be more aware of, again, how to mediate situations. Dream analysis. You know what, this is a really tricky one because Freud was very into dream analysis, so was Jung, and some of these psychodynamic approaches really do still incorporate dream analysis. I'm not a dream analysis expert. I don't know what all the different things and symbols are, but suffice to say that when we are asleep, our brain sort of tries to work out those stresses and frustrations that we experience during the day and that our consciousness really can't manage. So it comes out oftentimes in our dreams that our brain is trying to work it out and make sense of things in our dreams. So sometimes it's just the pizza that you ate the night before, and sometimes it's really your brain trying to work out stressful situations. Freud wouldn't agree that it's ever the pizza, but okay. What I would say is that in clinical practice, I don't ever say that I am trained in doing any dream analysis. But what I find is that oftentimes clients, their brain came up with it, okay? So oftentimes they can draw the connections and tell you exactly what it is that they think the dream means, and that can be very helpful to the client. So I had a woman come in, and she was very distressed because she had a reoccurring dream, and she had it like 12 or 13 times, and she was in a house where there was furniture, but there was nothing on the walls. There was no window treatments, nothing on the walls. And she was in a very influential position in her job, and was really struggling to sort of feel grounded. And so we started talking about, like, what would it mean if you had things on the walls, if you put things on the walls in your house? And she said, well, that would mean that I'm staying, that I'm secure, that I'm not going to be moving anytime soon, that I would feel more grounded and that I was secure in staying where I was. And so then that sort of provided the avenue for us to really explore some of that. Is why wasn't she feeling grounded? What was it about her current situation? What techniques could she use to start feeling a little more grounded and a little more secure in her current situation? I didn't interpret her dream. I just asked her questions about how she might interpret her dream and what the symbolism behind things in her dream. And from there, we sort of had a platform to talk about what was going on. So that's really what I would suggest. And then this idea of analysis of the resistance. Sometimes people come in and they're like, hey, this isn't about my mom. This isn't about my attachments. And they really are just more resistant to looking at anything in the past. And so we might want to also bring that into the consciousness of, Like what's behind that avoidance and that resistance? Okay, so some limitations of this approach, just so that you know, is that it's very time consuming. Traditional psychoanalysis would happen over like a 2 to 3 year time period where people are in therapy for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. Newsflash, in our current society, that is not going to happen. Insurance companies aren't going to pay for it. It would be way too expensive, and it's just not going to happen. That's not to say that psychoanalytics is really a dying breed. Here in Maryland, we have a psychoanalytic society where once you're fully licensed, you can do an additional 3 years of training to become a psychoanalyst, and you have to go through your own analysis for 3 years. You have to meet with somebody numerous times a week, and they provide training and then supervision of you doing analysis. So it's an excellent training, but as you can tell, it's time consuming and it's very, very expensive. And it requires you to be highly trained. And also, I mean, here's the thing. Last week we talked about how the person of the counselor is so important in establishing that therapeutic relationship, and oftentimes the sort of healing presence that we provide and who we are and how we approach therapy is the key determinant to people getting better. Well, okay, in this theory, the therapist is really not displaying empathy and not displaying, they are a blank slate, and that's purposeful. So there's some debate as to how useful this really is because of that. Now, more modern psychodynamic approaches do allow for some flexibility in how anonymous the therapist stays in the therapy, but never do we get rid of the fight that the object of our client's. We need to limit our self-disclosure in that way and maintain that analytic frame. Okay, so that sort of rounds out our discussion on psychoanalytics. I'm going to stop, and I'm probably going to come back to object relations and Adlerian later on, so that you can have another little video to watch. I will say, let me just say this about Erikson really quick, because many of you are very familiar with Erikson because we talked about it in human development. But if you look at this chart here, you'll see that these stages, the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital, they align perfectly with Erikson's stages, and the only difference is that once we get past 6 years old with the phallic stage, latency and genital, and then we get into young adulthood, Erikson said, you know, we develop, our personality develops across the lifespan, and we have these sort of polar opposite conflicts that we have to resolve in each stage of our life. And so it doesn't just stop at 6. We have more growth to do throughout the whole lifespan, and we negotiate these things as we progress through life. So you can see this comparison here. I'm not really going to go over Erikson because I know you've had that in human development. Not pull out that human development book and take another look at these content issues that we have to then negotiate throughout the lifespan. All right, I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. I'm going to stop recording, and I'll post another video where we go over Adler and object relations, and then I'm going to post a little video on how to do your assignment. All right, see you on Thursday evening for our question and answer. We're going to watch some videos and talk about some cases. Take care.